Now, when we begin this practice, probably the most common experience is that we simply get carried away, meaning as soon as some thought or emotion or memory or something comes up, we grab hold of it and off we go on our stories. Because this is our strong habit. This is generally what we do in daily life. Something comes up in our mind, we get caught up in it. So of course, if that happens, then as with all distractions in Shamatha practice, when we notice we've got caught up and carried away, again, the first thing to do is simply relax, to avoid, of course, getting irritated by that, being frustrated. Release, grasping onto that thought, and very gently return to observing the mind. So relax, release, return. Simply keep coming back again and again and again and again. But if we find that we're just constantly getting swept away, then there is a few short-term strategies that we can introduce that can help us to get into the practice. One of those is what we've already mentioned and brought into that meditation. Is labeling or noting. That is, give a name to the mental event. But keep it simple. Because if we make it too involved, it'll just become commentary on commentary on commentary on commentary. And also, for example, if we have some anger arising about a certain person, then not a good idea here to label getting angry about this person. Not a good idea. Because that'll just get caught up. So if it's something like that, just go anger. Label the object. And don't include in the label the object of that anger, for example. Or if you have a thought, some pleasant memory, don't say memory about something or thought about something, because that'll feed your getting caught up. So just go thought, memory, image, frustration, anger, jealousy. Keep it very simple. And again, this is something we're adding to the practice, so it's not part of the practice. So again, like counting the breath, there's a cost benefit. And initially there may be more benefit than cost, meaning if we're getting distracted a lot, it may help us to avoid getting distracted. But of course the cost is we're actually adding something into the practice. So at some point we'll need to let that go and just observe directly. But in the short term you may find that helpful. Similarly with this, there's another short-term strategy we can use if we're just getting continuously swept away. And that is, we can anchor ourselves in the breath. Because even, you may find even labeling or noting doesn't really work very well. Then what you can do is go back into the body and anchor yourself in the breath. And for this, I would recommend the rhythm of the breath. So go back in the body and just focus on that rhythm of the breath. Have that as your main object. And then once you're established in that, again, being very relaxed, then just start to notice a little bit in the corner of your mind your thoughts and emotions and so forth. But your main object is still the breath. So you're anchoring yourself in the breath. And that can help avoid getting swept away. So you're mainly focusing on the breath and just noticing a little bit in the corner of the mind any thoughts and emotions. And then over time, you can shift the emphasis. Less emphasis on the breath, more on the thoughts and emotions. But again, if you start to get caught up, shift the emphasis back more to the breath. So we can use this as an anchor point to help us to get into the practice. But again, this is just a short-term strategy because eventually we'll need to let go of that altogether and just observe the mind. But you may find it helpful in the short term. So in the next meditation, you might like to experiment with that and see if that's helpful. And then the last one is to generate a thought. Because if we're just constantly getting swept away, it can be very disheartening and we go, oh, I can't do this at all. Because generally, if a thought or something comes up in our mind, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, here I come, get ready. Before you know it, it's there, and before you know it, you're gone. But if we generate a thought, if we deliberately generate a thought, we know it's coming, so we can be prepared for it, and we can watch that thought as it arises and passes. And so we can get a little bit of feeling of success. You know, I can do this a little bit. So you might like to do that a little bit if you're getting just completely frustrated and not being able to do it at all. So you can, do this occasionally and just watch. And when it disappears, just keep your attention right where it was and see what comes up next in that space. So that's something also. But again, that's just a short-term strategy like the previous two. But these three could be helpful in the short term to get into the practice. So use them if you find it helpful. So that's the most common experience generally when we start this practice. But there's one other very common experience also. Is that we sit down and we look and then suddenly there's no thoughts there. Normally my mind is full of thoughts, but now I'm looking and there's nothing really there. Normally as a beginner, that's not because suddenly our mind has become very quiet and still, unfortunately. Probably the most common reason why that's the case is that our focus is too intense. Because remember again, now in our daily life, whenever we want to focus on something, we tense. And here, because the object is very subtle, and we'll think that if I don't really pay close attention, I'm just going to get swept away. So not only are we then pay close attention, but we bring in tension to that. And we're doing this. And of course, if we're doing this, we're suffocating the mind. There's no space for anything to come up. So if you notice a lot of tension in your focus, relax, relax, relax. On every out breath, relax that tension. Another reason why sometimes there's not really any thoughts appearing that we're lacking clarity. A little bit like some of you may have noticed that when you started to focus here at the nostrils, maybe you didn't notice any sensations at all initially. That's not because there were no sensations there, it's because we didn't have very good clarity, because the sensations here are quite subtle. So similarly, if we're watching the mind and we're not very clear, then there can be a lot of things going on, but they don't register because of lacking clarity. So we talk about, I think Alan Walsh mentioned it, this threshold of conscious and subconscious, or conscious and unconscious. Now our threshold is quite high, meaning there's only very superficial mental activity that we notice, and there's a lot of mental activity going on down here that we don't notice because we're lacking clarity. So if we slowly improve our clarity, this threshold will move down and we'll start to notice more and more mental events, thoughts, emotions, and so forth. Another thing that can happen is we sit down and we watch, and then we go, there's no thoughts. What's going on? My mind is usually very active, but now it's gone completely quiet and still. I think I must be doing this practice wrong because there's absolutely nothing there. I don't know what I'm doing. All of this is thoughts. So again, if you're watching and you're getting frustrated, that's a mental event. So whatever, and you're getting bored, that's a mental event. Watch that, observe that. And then, of course, if there really is nothing there, then observe that empty space. It's not like when there's no thoughts we switch off, and only when there's thoughts we switch on. So if there really is no thoughts there, just observe that space and see what comes up next in that space. So that's a few things we can do when we either get carried away or there are no thoughts. One more point and then we'll go back to the practice. And that is, remember, in this practice, thoughts are not problems. In the breath practice, thoughts are problems. If a thought came up, we had to let it go and go back to the breath. Here, thoughts are part of the object. So therefore, let them be. So we're just observing thoughts. But what's the difference between mindfully thinking about something and observing thoughts? Because this practice is not mindfully thinking about things. That's not the practice. I mean, that's good to do in daily life, to be mindfully thinking about things when we need to, but that's not the practice here. So we're not mindfully thinking about things. We're observing thoughts. So what's the difference? For example, if I'm thinking about these flowers, what am I focusing on? The flowers. If I'm observing a thought about flowers, what am I focusing on? The thought, not the flowers. So what you'll notice is, initially, of course, when thoughts come up, we get carried away. We're completely lost. Once we manage to step back a little bit more and not get so much caught up, what we'll notice is, instead of getting completely lost in the story, we'll start to watch the story. But that story is still grasping. But at least watching a story unfold is better than getting lost in the story. But then if we step back even more and have less grasping, there won't even be a story. There'll just be random mental events, arising, passing, rising, passing. So these are the stages that we will go through. First, get completely lost in the story and come back. Then when we can sort of step back a bit more, instead of getting completely lost, we'll sort of see the story unfolding. So there's still some grasping. And if we let go of that, then there really won't be a story. There'll just be these random mental events, arising, passing, rising, passing. Okay? So at least if you're mindfully watching a story, at least that's better than getting lost in the story. But mindfully watching the story is still involving grasping. So we need to really just keep letting go, letting go, letting go. But that'll take time. So that's the sort of steps we're going to go through. Okay. Let's go back to the practice again, and keeping in mind some of these ideas here and bringing them in if you find them helpful. And then after meditation, one more point I wanted to mention about the practice before lunch. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. And simply becoming aware of the rhythm of your breath. Now, whilst maintaining that basis of a relaxed body and mind, allow your eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. And then bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Observing thoughts and other mental events as they arise and pass, without following them, without trying to get rid of them. And if you're finding that you're constantly getting caught up and getting carried away, you might like to experiment with labeling or noting mental events. Or if you prefer, you might like to go back into the body and anchor yourself in the breath. So that is, focus on the rhythm of the breath, have that as your main object, and then just a little bit in the corner of your mind, notice your thoughts and emotions and so on.